Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Continuing Year-Round series at CNS Summit. Today, I'm extremely pleased to be able to welcome Jamie Macdonald, CEO at Parexel, to discuss a topic that's really been on top of mind for everyone, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Jamie, welcome and thank you for being willing to volunteer to have a discussion around this topic.
Amir, always happy to catch up with you, particularly on important topics. So looking forward to the discussion.
That's fantastic. Well, let's start by asking you what your thoughts are around how the pandemic has impacted our thinking around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
A good question. I think if we rewound to when many of us were together at CNS Summit at the end of 2019, we'd have never predicted a global pandemic and the way that it's changed our world. I think we also wouldn't have predicted that as an industry that we would have been able to take vaccines from essentially discovery and early development through to patients in probably 18 months or less. I mean, really some very interesting developments in the pandemic. What's still coming out of that, though, is we can see the pandemic has disproportionately impacted certain populations. Certain groups, whether that be by race or ethnicity or even region. I mean, geographic disparities in COVID are clear. I think there's going to have to be a lot of work to understand if we were to be subject to a pandemic again, which is highly likely. I think all the epidemiologists and virologists would tell us that that's going to happen. How would we as a society be better prepared and deal with some of the challenges that we've seen from the pandemic, particularly around inclusion of representative patient populations in clinical trials, access to vaccines, access to therapies across the globe and across different populations. I think we've also seen a rise in probably some discrimination, not just in the healthcare system, but at a societal level. And that's really brought into focus the importance of diversity, equity, inclusion, and to be honest, just treating people with fairness and respect in the healthcare system, in drug development, but in society as a whole.
You know, I'm glad you mentioned kind of global perspective, because sometimes I think in the US, we're very US centric. So I can think of kind of the latest ethical dilemma that I've been thinking about, which is it fair for us to vaccinate children in the US before we vaccinate elderly people globally in countries where they don't have access to the vaccine at all yet? You know, that's a very, the type of question we have to think about when we think about equity and diversity in a way, right?
Absolutely. And I think this is a question where I think we would have all expected a more cohesive global response. The challenge is which organization sort of picks up that burden. Is it somebody like the WHO? Is it the broader United Nations, or is it a collaborative of groups? But definitely, we've even seen some of that disparity here in the US, where state by state, and certainly I'm a supporter of the federal system, but state by state, there are different rules on vaccinations in different populations.
Yeah.
But I think it's certainly something that as a society globally, there needs to be more focus on how that response should be coordinated. I think many of us know that certain countries have certainly overbooked or overcontracted the number of vaccines that they would need to vaccinate with even double doses for the mRNA vaccines, their entire population, in some instances, 7 or 8 times more than their entire population, yet clearly other countries are struggling with access to vaccines. And that brings in an entirely different question is we can see the rise of the mutations and variants that as a global problem, if we aren't able to sort of suppress the virus and its mutation and spread, even in other countries, when do we get back to normal in terms of the usual travel and migration of people across the globe? So definitely an issue.
Absolutely. Now, thinking about the pandemic in terms of our world of clinical research, sort of within our world, within healthcare, as you mentioned, there's plenty for us as life sciences to be proud of in terms of what we've produced in 18 months. But how do you think the pandemic has changed the way we view clinical research as a whole?
I think there's been some important learnings, and some around diversity, equity, and inclusion, some around the acceleration of development in a crisis, and do we learn some of those best practices? So maybe let's take it in two pieces. We can see that in certain countries that the COVID disease has impacted certain populations at a higher incidence than other populations. And some of that may be race and ethnicity. Some of it may be social determinants of health, where people live, their environment, density of housing, communication about some of the preventative measures to avoid transmitting the virus as well. So there's a lot of learning on that side that I think we can ensure next time that we're educating the wider population. What's probably been concerning to me and you is some of the mixed messaging and some of the clearly factually wrong messaging and information that has sort of perpetrated through social media and other areas. There's a large rise in anti-vax sentiment around the globe, and it's maybe surprising, a little concerning. And I don't think it all relates to necessarily COVID and coronavirus and vaccines. It may be some skepticism with governments, some of the larger institutions, and to some extent, maybe even the pharma industry. And I think we've done really good things in the last 18 months as an industry, but I think we also still realize that we have work to do to educate the broader community around clinical trials. I remember hearing a few years ago that certain parts of the community thought that clinical trials were only for people suffering from cancer. Clearly, we all know that, particularly you, and I think we have to learn that there is a need to educate people as to the opportunity to participate in clinical research and what that means for them as an individual, but what it means for those people that suffer with the disease and the need to bring new, better, safer therapies to patients over time. I mean, the drug development continuum has to be supported by not just our industry or investigators, but clearly the wider society, patients, regulators, and other stakeholders as well.
That's great. I want to change topics slightly. You lead a large global organization. How do you think the pandemic has made you and companies in general reimagine the future of work?
Well, I think both of us are at home at the moment. Most of my team are working from home. And there's certainly been a learning curve. I think it's maybe gone better than we might have expected. I think we were very fortunate as a society that for a lot of us, but not all, again, there are some challenges in terms of having equal provision of technologies, internet access, the ability to work remotely, even having the space to be able to work remotely. How do you handle virtual meetings? I mean, you've now seen this across CNS Summit. But I think all of us feel we do want to get back together in person at some point at the right time. And then additionally, I think the emotional and sort of mental sort of burden that I think isolation to some extent and the lockdowns and the changing timeline for returning to whatever new normal looks like, we have to realize that is a burden that a lot of our employees have to deal with. Managing elderly parents, dealing with school-age children, dealing with children that are trying to keep up with their academics. There is disparity there for people that have access to space, access to technology, versus those who may not have equal access.
Yeah, it's funny for me, there's a kind of almost analog to what we talk about around decentralized trials, where we talk about flexibility and optionality. It seems to me it's kind of an analogy where for people and how they can work, whether corporations can have kind of that flexibility to be able to see what might work, depending on the person's position and responsibilities, right?
I fully agree. We're watching very closely, not just within our industry, but as society as a whole, what are companies planning to do, even as vaccines become widely available and we move into maybe a greater area of herd immunity and maybe improved therapies where COVID is no longer a disease that presents the mortality risk that it does now. Do we ever get back to the same in-office situation? I don't think so. How do you offer flexibility with hours. We already do that. I think a lot of companies have talked about that, but allowing people to manage childcare, care of the elderly parents or others in need. But how do they still get the work done, and how do you facilitate that to provide most flexibility? There is a selfish economic benefit. I'm an economist and an accountant by training. I think happy employees that feel that they're well supported, it's easier to retain them. They should be motivated, engaged, and productive. How do you measure that? And I think that becomes important. But I think most employees, particularly in our industry, would welcome a degree of autonomy in the way that they work, subject to certain parameters. And then if they have flexibility, I think that is ultimately beneficial for them individually, but for us as employers as well.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I've heard you previously talk about a diversity, equity, and inclusion mindset. What is that exactly, and how do you lead an organization with such a mindset?
So I won't take credit for this. I've been at Parexel just over 3 years, but we've had a head of global diversity, equity, and inclusion for 6.5 years. And it almost has to be in everything that you do across the organization. It's not just relative to clinical trials and the inclusion of diverse patients, but it's going to be represented in your board of directors, your management team, your employee base, your hiring practices, your onboarding, your outreach to the community, even collaborating with sources of candidates that are coming into the organization, the universities and colleges that you reach out to, the hospitals that you work with. And I think it has to be in pretty much every area of the organization. We have to realize diversity is important. I think people bringing not just race, ethnicity, gender, and those components, but diversity of experience as well. We're a global organization. As much as you and I have traveled to different parts of the globe, I don't pretend to know some of the cultural differences in all the countries that we operate. We have to have the right people there locally that understand, yes, the local regulations and rules, but also the cultural aspects as well. And I think I've probably learned most in my travels to Asia and the differences there and how that plays into how we run research in different parts of the globe. And obviously we work with different regulators around the globe. They have different rules, particularly on the representation of their society in the trials that ultimately lead to market authorization, whether it's Japan or China or India or elsewhere.
Completely agree. Now, what steps is you and Parexel taking to promote clinical trial diversity?
Yeah, and this is not exclusive to Parexel. I think we've done some really nice work. I think it's important that it becomes a collective effort across all the stakeholders. And I think we've seen some great leadership from your organization, but other collaborative groups as well. We've seen that at ACRO, which is an industry association. We've seen a lot of discussion with customers, probably very authentic discussion. I think you and I probably are pretty good at spotting lip service to certain initiatives and events. I think this is authentic and a real understanding that clinical trial populations have to represent ultimately the population that we intend to treat with approved products. There's a whole variety of reasons, dosages, safety, but availability. And I think you've got to go beyond our traditional routes of clinical research. Historically, we were always looking to optimize and maximize the speed of enrollment in clinical trials. And because time is money in the way that this industry operates. I think everybody now at all stakeholder levels realize that the population that is included in a clinical trial has to be representative of the population that will be treated in the future. But you've got to put those building blocks in place early on. You've got to work with the investigative sites. You've got to work with the physicians themselves. You've got to work with the hospital systems. You've got to work with the patient groups and communities and look at how they gather information. We've started to partner, and I think it will be a partnership event across the industry where you work with other groups. I don't think anybody will solve this themselves. So in addition to working obviously with customers, we've worked with groups like Signify Health, the Society for Clinical Research Sites, SCRS, the Center for Information on Study of Clinical Research Participation, or CSCRIP. Each of those brings different solutions on outreach to patients, investigators, community groups, caregivers, improving the patient experience. I think maybe the most surprising thing to me is feedback over the years that patients didn't necessarily feel the engagement and the support and the encouragement and the feedback that they would expect in clinical research. I think that's improved, even pre-pandemic. I think it's improved. A number of the customers now share outputs from clinical studies, even those studies that have failed. The opening up of access in open label studies. Even in the COVID vaccine world, if you were on the placebo side of the vaccine, does that give you early access to the vaccine once it's approved? And we know that the approvals are on EUAs and not necessarily full approvals yet. So all those debates have been happening. The patient navigator tools, the patient engagement tools, the support tools have been really important. Helping train sites and have sites understand how do they reach out to diverse populations? How do they include people that might not otherwise consider clinical research? And what are those barriers? Is it logistics? Is it a financial barrier? Is it support for childcare or transport? I think if we can overcome the barriers and identify them early, that gives us a real opportunity to make sure there is not just diversity in the clinical trial population, but equity in terms of the availability of that clinical trial to the broader population. And that gets into a whole discussion around social determinants of health and maybe some of the health inequalities that we see in society outside of what we're doing on clinical research.
So that was a really great comprehensive answer there, Jamie. I think what you started with, which I would fully endorse, is what you said was really this is an area we have to collaborate on. And I think everyone, and it's one of those areas that are really pre-competitive, right? This is something that competing organizations can absolutely work together on. And you've given good examples of that, like ACRO, et cetera. So
I'd also highlight CNS Summit and the work that you and the team have done. You've brought people together that would otherwise not necessarily spend a lot of time together or share ideas and best practices. And we've seen this. People enjoy the collaboration. I think we all know where our intellectual property is and our competitive differences. But I think a collaborative industry ultimately benefits everybody, particularly the patients at the end of the day.
And you mentioned how you're working with sites to increase diversity. How's that been going, and what's been the reaction of sites kind of getting help from you to think about these issues and operationalize them?
I think their awareness has increased as well. So I think they're maybe more open than they would have been, maybe even pre-pandemic. I think the media coverage of certainly the disparities in COVID disease, but also the challenges in finding the diverse populations for some of the clinical studies has certainly highlighted that to the site and investigator level. So more collaboration, earlier engagement, discussion around appropriate inclusion-exclusion criteria, using innovative strategies, patient-centered protocols we've talked about for a number of years, but we're seeing much greater uptake. At a Parexel level, we have a patient advisory council. We engage early. Getting that early feedback from patient and caregivers is important. And then the broader inclusion, not just race and ethnicity, but gender and LGBTQ+ participants. It's definitely improved. I think there's still a ways to go, but I think sites and the community has certainly embraced it.
So you talked about a lot of different initiatives. Are you seeing kind of tangible results from those? Are there some that you've covered some already, but?
Yeah, I think some of the results are positive, but I think there's still work to be done. I think the COVID environment has challenged patient enrollment in non-COVID therapeutic areas to differing degrees. And we've seen sort of mixed enrollment. In some areas, patients like being under the direct care of an investigator and a strict protocol and regular contact with a physician, even if that's through a telehealth visit rather than an in-person visit. But in other areas, I think where you already have an existing condition that is probably well maintained under the standard of care, there's a reluctance to subject yourself or expose yourself to greater risk of COVID infection. And so I think we're waiting to see a return to a more normal environment from a clinical trial standpoint. But the early signs are positive. I think sites are challenged with their own protocols and resource and social distancing and even isolation of people that have been contact traced and potentially have exposure. So we're dealing with a very constrained environment at the site level. We've tried to support that more as an industry, but I think a return to normal, we'll start to see sort of even better results than we've seen now. But so far, positive.
Great. Now, I know that you've conducted some E&I research related to increasing access for patients to clinical trials. What are the key takeaways that research taught you?
I think it's always better to come into a situation, whether it's diversity, equity, and inclusion or others, and actually do some grounded research and make sure that you are not going in with the wrong hypothesis. So it was important that we did that. It was pretty extensive. We've shared that and are happy to share it more broadly. Building trust in research is absolutely critically important. Patients and the trust they have with a physician or investigator or a site is critically important. There are clearly negative historic biases. We all know the history of certain events. The Tuskegee syphilis study was just one example, but the industry has advanced so much since then. And I think the ethic oversight, the conduct, the regulatory oversight, quality has improved. But yeah, there's definitely some barriers. On the COVID side, low expectation of participation in COVID vaccine and therapy trials from diverse communities. That's what we heard from the investigator group. Lack of trust in the industry. So it goes back to that trust word. And maybe some of the stigma around infectious disease. In certain populations, there is a stigma associated with being unwell or having a disease or being contagious. And a lot of that goes back to the history of other infectious diseases over time. Certainly employing different models has definitely helped. I think the decentralized clinical trial model has definitely allowed broader access. There are financial barriers, but it's less just about the financial barrier, but the time taken to participate in a study is time away from work, it's time away from earning. How do you accommodate that? I think the industry has improved in terms of reimbursement for patient participation and what that truly means without it being an inducement. I think we've all historically been concerned that you don't want an inducement for people to participate in research, but at the same time, you don't want them out of pocket or disadvantaged by research. And then I think beyond that, I think making sure that the connectivity of that patient to that site is continuous. I think in certainly your world in CNS, patient history and that patient record over time is a critical, important part of inclusion criteria. How do you ensure that people stay under care, that they are going through the preventative checks, that there is early detection of disease, and that the complexity of comorbidities is addressed in the protocol?
So Jamie, we talked about implementing health equity in clinical trials. Do you think that this will actually stick, or do you think there's a danger of us actually going back again?
Hopefully not. I think we've adopted the we've adopted the no going back mentality. I think we've got to work with all the stakeholders. I think certainly the regulators have been flexible in the current environment. I think they will look at the outcomes from current research and the quality of data and the oversight of patient care and welfare in the pandemic and see whether that's been of an acceptable standard. So I expect a lot of lessons learned to come from the output and validation or verification of existing clinical trials. But I think things like operational flexibility, adoption of new models, decentralized clinical trials, the use of remote patient engagement strategies, the eCOA and ePro devices. We're working on hundreds of DCT trials and many hundreds of patient engagement strategies, and seeing good learnings from those. I think we're seeing good data in the most part, but where we're not, we're adapting and refining for future use. We've certainly seen better adoption at the customer level as well. It's an early discussion with customers rather than a rescue discussion. You'll remember the days that patient engagement always became a rescue strategy for a study rather than embedded up front. So I think the no going back mentality is important.
That's great. So there are certain areas such as gene therapy, rare diseases, where we're dealing with very small population in a clinical trial. Do you think one can still apply these principles of diversity and equity even in those trials?
So simple answer, probably not all the time. I mean, there are certain diseases that are very specific to particularly a genetic origin. I think is the most likely ones. We've seen that. We know that cystic fibrosis really impacts those of Northern European heritage. Sickle cell, we know, is predominantly those of Africa or Southern Europe heritage. So the answer is no, not in all instances. But I think good epidemiology, good understanding of population and prevalence of incidence in disease across different populations, whether that's race, ethnicity, or even origin as well. I think sometimes these words get interchanged and they don't necessarily always mean the same to the biologists and geneticists that are trying to parse out a particular origin of a disease. I think trial design will change as well. I think looking at the right endpoints, looking at the endpoints that are important to the patient population, ensuring safety, and then I think we'll see some of the conditional approval and long-term follow-up for some of the rare diseases to ensure that the outcomes are what was expected by those that have approved the study and the patients that benefit from these new therapies as well.
Great. Now, beyond what we've discussed already, have you had other learnings personally through this process?
Yes, I mean, COVID and the pandemic, I think all of us have changed the way that we've operated, the way that we've communicated. Building relationships and trusted relationships across multiple stakeholders is important. Collaboration is important with patients, patient advocacy, physicians, the broader community. Still work to be done, but I think we've seen great strides, not just in COVID, but actually in the other therapeutic areas that have had to adapt because of the pandemic. But change is going to require long-term openness. I think transparency is improving. I think we're watching, obviously, the outcomes from some of the vaccine trials and the way that the regulators have reacted and maybe changed position, not just on the therapeutic side, but whether it's mask wearing, social distancing, contact tracing, what gets us to the end of the pandemic. And I think transparency and support to improve outcomes overall is critically important. For us, diversity, equity, and inclusion as an organization is important. In the way that we work and engage with our customers and vendors and suppliers is important. And then ensuring that then feeds through into the way that we help design, support, and execute clinical trials.
You know, Jamie, I really appreciate, as I said at the beginning, for you to be willing to do this interview and really talk about your perspective and for people to understand really how perhaps corporations are thinking about this important issue. So I really appreciate that, and hope to see you at CNS Summit in person later in November. And thank you very much for your time.
You're welcome. I'm hoping November we will be in person, and certainly we can see you again. I think we're all ready for it, and the CNS Summit community as well. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you.